everybody, welcome back to English 229. This is our class for Monday, October 2nd. So believe it or not, we're already in October. And as you know, I have talked a little bit about paper number 1, about how I'm offering a paper topic from an Emily Dickinson quote, that one need not be a chamber to be haunted, and talked a little bit about how that quote might be applicable to one of the earlier texts we are reading this semester. So that probably means either Frankenstein or Edgar Allan Poe, which is where we're at now, or ultimately Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that I've got a rolling deadline for that paper, but the sooner you submit in that paper, probably the better off everybody is. The hard deadline that I have is midway through the semester, because by that point, I think that you should have submitted in a paper. Certainly we can negotiate if you haven't submitted in a paper by that point, but the rest of the semester goes very quickly, and there's still a paper number 2 that's due at the ending of the semester. However, everybody has the option for writing paper number 1. Another reason for submitting it in early, so I can give you some feedback and return that to you. If you elect to do so, you can rewrite it for a higher grade, incorporating my comments and reaching out to me if you need further direction. And I just ask that you submit in your revision with the original graded copy so I can compare and contrast the two. And you would have up until the ending of the semester to do that, but the earlier the better, obviously, for everybody involved. And this would be a critical paper, so you're not relying on outside sources, and it would be approximately 4 to 5 pages. That would be double space, 1-inch margins. And our syllabus talks a little bit about some of the conventions of writing a paper, specifically the formatting, though I'm hopeful that this is something that you would have talked about in previous English classes as well. And part of what I wanted to talk about today were some of the conventions associated with writing a paper. That said, I also wanted to introduce Edgar Allan Poe. And as we know, we began the semester with Lovecraft, talking quite a bit about Edgar Allan Poe from Lovecraft's perspective in supernatural horror and literature, that Poe was perhaps the best Gothic writer, at least up until the point of Lovecraft's life. And one of the things that Lovecraft really admired about Poe was his ability to discuss psychological states. And certainly there's an element of that in Frankenstein, as we had discussed, but this sense of the narrator, and in this instance with Poe, it's usually a first-person narrator who's a detached chronicler of events. And these events incorporate things like strangeness and gloom and atmosphere, all of the things we've come to associate with the Gothic tradition. And this idea of maintaining a single mood or impression is really something that we expect in the short story. One might say that he in many ways contributed to the creation of the modern day short story and the way that we think of it, just like Poe has also been attributed with creating the modern day mystery novel in the way that we think about it as well. And Poe has quite a large body of work. I just selected a handful of stories for us to study over the course of the next class or two, just so that we could get a sense as to how Poe is able to use both the ambiguity of psychology and the elements of possible supernatural to end up with pieces, I think, that are very effective. That said, I think that what you will find with Poe is that his biography is in fact just as fascinating as his writing. And that's not to say the same couldn't be said of Shelley. In fact, you might be aware that Shelley almost lost a child in childbirth, and the idea also of her own mother dying when Shelley was young, and all of these things contributed probably to Shelley's text. But in terms of Edgar Allan Poe, he was well known for his drug and his alcohol issues, and I think you can see that embedded in many of the stories that he wrote, particularly the stories that I've selected for this particular class. And he married his 13-year-old cousin. We talked a little bit about this too when we were talking about Frankenstein and how odd it might seem that Victor would be betrothed to Elizabeth, even though they weren't blood relations, but they were reared in the same family. and I had indicated that it was not unusual actually for blood relations to marry during this time period in the 1800s, particularly if they wanted to maintain a certain level of status, or family name. And certainly, I think that Edgar Allan Poe is best known for the fact that he used and abused drugs and also married his own cousin. Some of Poe's fears include being buried alive. Keep this in mind when we read some of Poe's stories, because you will see that being a rather common horror motif in his works. And I think you'll also find that he had good reason for perhaps his fear of being buried alive. There were even conventions at the time period when people were buried, and they attached actually strings and bells to their bodies so that when they were buried, in the event if they had been buried prematurely, they could pull on the string, which would be attached to a bell above ground to notify individuals that basically they were still alive. Obviously, medical science was in its infancy compared to today. But even still, occasionally you will hear a very odd story about something happening in a morgue or even a funeral home where it's thought that somebody is dead and then it turns out that they're not. So, the fear of the unknown, I think, is one of the things that we talked about in the early part of this semester. Believe it or not, we're already in week 5. And I think that that's something that Poe embraces, as well as the idea of the past continually haunting the present. And that's also a very common Gothic motif. So, the 4 stories that I had selected, The Fall of the House of Usher, I suspect that one you might be less familiar with. It's the longer of the stories that I've selected. And a lot of it is about atmosphere and also the sins of the generational past. I don't want to give away too many spoilers. But at any rate, that text is probably different in terms of its narration and its subject matter than some of the other stories that we will be reading, such as The Mask of the Red Death. And it occurs to me that after we've experienced COVID, there are perhaps multiple similarities with The Mask of Red Death, which is about a plague that happens to be ravishing the countryside and the attempt to escape the realities of death. The Telltale Heart and the Black Cat, the last 2 pieces. And you'll notice that in the 3rd section in our notes, I have web links for these pieces. I had ordered also a text for our class, the Dover edition. So they put together text in a fairly financially, I think, affordable way. It's one of the reasons why I had ordered a Dover text. But that said, you could certainly find these works online, and I've just provided the websites for you. Though I personally prefer paper because then you can annotate text a little bit better. So, both The Telltale Heart and The Black Cat, we've got narrators who are grappling with insanity and, again, the consequences of past actions, without my giving away too many spoilers. So I hope that by this point, I'm assuming actually by this point, you would have finished reading Frankenstein. What would be ideal is that you've also finished reading Poe's 4 short stories, which I will talk about further next class, and that you are beginning our next piece, which happens to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, and that is a novella, so it is longer than a short story, much like we saw with Poe, but not nearly as long as a novel, as we'll see with Frankenstein or Dracula. And Dracula is the longest novel of the semester. It occurs about midway through the semester. The good news is that after Dracula, things speed up rather rapidly, not just in terms of the content of the readings, because they're written in more contemporary fashions, but also in terms of length. They're usually shorter readings. So if you think of the semester as a hill, we're still going up that hill. I see Dracula as the pinnacle of that hill. And then, of course, our descent. And I always think of Dracula as separate novels, which I will talk about when we get to Dracula. That might make it a little bit easier to digest in terms of its length. But as I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the paper because my hope is that you're thinking about the paper. I suggested, though, that you may not want to submit in a paper until we've had a chance as a class to talk about the text that you decide to write about. Certainly, there are lots of possibilities with Frankenstein, but as we will soon see, there are also possibilities with Poe and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the topic that I've suggested is just merely that, a suggestion. You are free to create your own topic. Though if you do create your own topic, you need to have the topic approved by me. And it has to be on one of the texts that we're reading during the first part of the semester. So that would be either Frankenstein or Poe or Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. My suspicion is that Dracula would be a better text to address in paper number 2. Paper number 2 will be very similar to paper number 1. The distinction being that paper number 2 will be on some of the later texts, starting with Dracula and then moving to the ending of the semester. But I encourage you to, begin thinking sooner rather than later in terms of which text you might select for your first paper. And that said, I wanted to give some conventions for writing papers. And in our syllabus and other documents folder, you'll see a handout about the critical paper. In fact, this was a handout that was distributed to me when I was an undergraduate student. I've kept it all these years. And I still find it to be excellent in terms of its review about how to write a paper. That said, I'm sure that you probably have had instruction in this in the past, and I'm sure too that you might have reference books that you can access about this. But I wanted to very quickly review this idea of the 3 steps to writing a paper. And the first step is planning. And I can tell you most students skip that step. They go straight to the writing step. You're making it a much more difficult exercise for yourself. In fact, what writers oftentimes do is they try to write what I call the perfect first sentence. And they waste a lot of time doing that rather than trying to generate ideas in the planning stage. And that's the beauty about generating ideas. They don't have to be used. You don't need to show them to anybody. They don't have to be correct. All you're doing is you're trying to come up with possible arguments that you might be discussing. In fact, one of the things that I would oftentimes do when I was writing a paper was to select quotes that I thought were particularly effective in terms of things that I could turn into a paper. So that's one of the ways that you could proceed if you wanted to. Not that that's the only way that you could proceed. And basically, once I found those quotes, then it was a question of organizing those quotes. The second piece, the writing piece, is when you do the actual organization and the drafting. And of course, it's not supposed to be perfect. And for your eyes only, unless you decide to share it with someone. But it's beginning to take the form of a paper with sentences and paragraphs. And then finally, there's the editing stage. And I can tell you that most writers skip that stage as well, because ultimately they've run out of time and they've run out of energy. And you want to save a little bit something for the end. I usually suggest that if you can, to try to finish a paper and put it away for a couple of days so that you can view it with a fresh eye when you're editing it. I understand that may not be possible, but at least for a few hours. And if you have difficulty when you're editing, one tip that was in the handout that I put in syllabus and other documents folder is to read backwards, because now you're not focusing on the content of the paper. Instead, what you are focusing on are the sentences, and that's where you can find sentence level errors with grammar and mechanics, for instance. So the general construction of a paper is that you have an introductory paragraph. Now keep in mind that a paragraph is 3 or more sentences long. A paragraph has an introduction, so that's the first sentence, oftentimes called the topic sentence, and it oftentimes summarizes what that paragraph is about. So if you have written strong paragraphs, you should be able to read just the first sentences of your paper and get a kind of skeletal outline, which is actually advised to you in that handout that I had put in syllabus and other documents. Not that everything is always well written, and not that every topic sentence has to serve as a summary. But basically, you need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. for a paragraph and also for a paper. And in terms of the topic sentence, that would be your beginning. And then the middle would be where you have evidence and details, and you probably have multiple sentences there, but at the very minimum one. And then you've got some sort of a concluding sentence that gives closure onto that idea. Every paragraph talks about basically a different idea. And you get to determine how broad or how specific your paragraph idea is going to be based on the construction of the opening sentence. So that said, I know that in the media you might read 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs, but that would not be appropriate for academia, nor usually when we talk about the kind of formal writing that's required in the workplace, which is why college classes focus on some of these conventions, formal conventions of writing, because these are the same conventions that you'll be expected to utilize in the workplace. So in your introductory paragraph, you usually have your thesis. This is your main point. I'm well aware you may not know what your thesis is until you're done writing your paper, because part of writing the paper is an exploration. So that said, I've had students do this, and I've done this myself, is that you write the paper, and then after you're done writing it, you reread what you've written. You summarize in 1 or 2 sentences what you've written. That is your thesis that you could plug into the introductory paragraph. So it need not be chronological, the writing that you do. But it should be your main point in 1 or 2 sentences. The introduction also includes additional information, such as the name of the author and the name of the text or text that you're happening to be discussing. So it should be fairly clear to the reader after your first paragraph what your paper is about and which author you're writing about and which text you're writing about. And then your body paragraphs. This is where you have your evidence and your details, where you use a mixture of paraphrase, putting things in your own words, and also quotation, word for word. And you can see this in the notes below in the 4th section about writing papers. And I've used this analogy before, that basically you're much like a courtroom attorney, and you are gathering together pieces of evidence to present to, I suppose, a judge. That would be me. And again, my job is to remain unbiased. And based on the evidence you present, is your argument possible? So you're not even held to the standard of the law that an attorney would be beyond a reasonable doubt. It just needs to be possible. It doesn't have to be probable or even correct. And the idea is that you're talking about something that reasonable people could disagree about. You're not just stating a fact. What you're doing is you're putting forth some sort of a premise that you are supporting with evidence from the text. And then you have your concluding paragraph. And that's an entire paragraph, 3 or more sentences. Remember, each of your body paragraphs have to be 3 or more sentences as well. The conclusion is one final paragraph that gives closure to your writing. So you shouldn't be introducing new ideas. If you were, that would be ultimately in your body. And you also don't want to repeat just what's in your introduction. So you want to save something for the ending, a little bit of energy, a little bit of time, and perhaps you can relate another text to your argument, or you can, and this usually works 9 out of 10 times, just relate what you're talking about to contemporary times. Not that you have to do that, but that'll oftentimes work in a pinch with the conclusion. And yes, you can, if you wanted to, review your main points, but again, you want to do it in a way so that you aren't just basically recopying your introduction. And sentences basically express complete thoughts. So a sentence needs to be able to stand on its own. So if you are looking for grammatical errors within a sentence, read each sentence as an independent unit. You shouldn't have to rely on the sentences beforehand or the sentences afterwards for that sentence to express a complete thought. This is oftentimes how fragments or incomplete sentences are written, is that it's an incomplete sentence, but the missing information to express a complete thought is either in the sentence prior or the sentence following. Again, it should express a complete idea. And punctuation is used to clarify meaning, because basically we take so much meaning from the oral presentation of language, things like vocal inflections. So there's a difference, for instance, between saying sit down, which would be indicated with a period, sit down, which would be indicated with a comma, or sit down, which would be indicated with an exclamation point. You can hear the distinction in my voice, but basically you wouldn't be able to hear that in a paper. So this is what we do, is we use punctuation. Commas are usually used for pauses where we would normally take a very brief pause or take a breath in conversation. Again, there are some rules for commas as well, but what I suggest is that you read your paper out loud, because oftentimes you can hear mechanical mistakes. It's almost like listening to music, where you may not be a musician, you may not even be able to read music, but you can probably hear when somebody has hit the wrong note. It just doesn't sound right. And unless you're going to be an English teacher, and then you do need to know the rules and the justification, if you're able to correct something that doesn't sound right so that it now is grammatically correct, that's enough. You want to just try to avoid as many grammatical errors as possible within your writing. So, some suggestions for writing, which you've probably heard of in other classes. Avoid the use of the I believe, I will argue. All of those are wordy. You want to try to be as concise as possible when you're writing. In theory, you should be able to go through each sentence and ask yourself, can I restate the sentence in fewer words without sacrificing meaning? And if so, then you're better off doing that, because what you end up having is a much tighter piece of writing. I understand you also end up with a shorter piece of writing, but better to have a shorter piece of writing that's well written than a longer piece of writing. In fact, many times what I'm doing when I'm reading papers is crossing out language that's just unnecessary, whether it be repetitious or it be wordy or whatever the case may be. So you don't need to make references to I. The assumption is that everything in the paper is what you think, what you believe, and what you argue. It's your paper after all. Avoid contractions. There is some debate about this, but I can tell you that I was schooled in a very traditional method, as you can see with the handout that I have in the syllabus and other documents folder. And words like don't and can't and won't, where we are contracting or putting together two separate words like do and not and making it one, don't. We do this all the time with our writing, but keep in mind that we speak differently, or we do this all the time, I should say, with our speaking. But keep in mind that we write differently than the way we speak. We want to have a different level of formality. So I can tell you if I see a contraction, I will circle it. I won't in any way have that influence your grade, but ultimately, I can't help myself. I just have to circle contractions. It's better off to have a little bit more formality than too informal. Avoid slang and trite expressions. So usually slang is language that's created to exclude other groups. It's what adolescents do every generation, for instance. And slang can go mainstream so that large groups are using slang. Saying something like, this person is cool, we're not talking about their temperature, we're really talking about their personality. That said, there's just a greater possibility of misunderstanding if you are using slang, so better to avoid it. And I usually reference a news story that occurred, actually, and I try to tell humor stories. This is not a humor story, so I warn you right now. This was in the 1990s, actually, so it was quite a while ago. Was a second language student who was going to a party, and he went to the wrong home, a home that had been burglarized previously. And let's just say that the owner was rather anxious. So when the student knocks on the door and the owner opens the door and the student asks, is this where the party is? The owner responds with a slang term you're probably familiar with, freeze, which means to stop. For whatever reason, if the student didn't understand or misheard or whatever the case was, he took a step forward, which is the exact opposite of freezing. The owner responded by pulling out his gun, which he always carried with him, and shooting it off and killing that student on his doorstep, all because of a terrible misunderstanding. And I use that as an example of just the greater possibility of misunderstanding if we're not using what's considered to be standard language. And I'm well aware that the language of the streets is oftentimes different But again, we want to have some standardization when we're writing. So trite expressions are expressions that are so overused that they don't really have any originality to them. The grass is always greener on the other side of the lawn, or dead as a doornail, or whatever the case may happen to be. Ironically, some of these expressions were actually created by Shakespeare. And they were not tried at the time. They were creative, but we don't even realize that we quote from Shakespeare all of the time. So, for instance, if you've ever said something like "jealousy's that green-eyed monster," that's from Shakespeare. That's from Othello. But again, it was creative when it was first constructed. It's considered to be lazy when you're using those expressions now in your writing, because ultimately you can say that in a more creative way. And again, we use these expressions all the time when we're talking. I'm not talking about the language that we use to communicate orally. We're talking about a formal academic paper, or perhaps a formal report you might write in the workplace. The documentation that we use, because the assumption is that you will be quoting from the text. You won't be quoting from outside sources, but you will be quoting from the text itself. And whether it be paraphrase, putting it in your own language, or quotation word for word. We use the MLA system of parenthetical documentation, Modern Language Association, which is the association devoted to the humanities that includes languages, that includes English. And there are other systems for different disciplines. For instance, using something like the APA, or the American Psychological Association. That would be for the sciences. You don't want to use the wrong system for the wrong discipline. So make sure you're using the MLA, which basically is based on using parentheses at the ending of a quote. So at the ending of a quote, whether you've completed that quote or not, and if you need to continue your sentence, that's fine. But at the ending of that quote, and it doesn't matter if you end your sentence or not, you put a parentheses, and within that parentheses, you indicate something like the page number of that quote. And you don't need to write P or PG or PAGE. The idea is that less is more here. And then you close your quotation marks, and then either you end your sentence with your ending punctuation, or you continue your sentence if necessary. And of course, you can add layers to this. So sometimes page number isn't sufficient if you're working with several texts from the same author. So if that's the case, you may need to include things like the actual name of the text and the page number. Or if you're working with multiple authors and it's unclear which author you're referencing, page number might not be enough. You might have to put the author's last name and the page number. So these are a set of rules that basically you're not supposed to memorize. I think of it as a cookbook. You basically look up your situation and you follow exactly. And sometimes it can be very precise about where you put commas and periods and so forth. And you just copy that. And in terms of our purposes, we're not doing an outside research paper. You're writing a critical paper, so you're relying on your own analysis. So outside of quoting from the actual text itself that you are analyzing for your paper, you shouldn't need to be quoting, which means that you're going to have a little bit of flexibility, because usually in this system, you include something called a works cited page, which is at the very ending of your paper, where you literally list all of the texts you have cited, you have quoted from, all of the websites and books and magazine articles and so forth and so on, by author's last name, and basically you give the details that a reader would need so they could find the text that you used, or at least the edition of the text that you used, so they could verify your quotation. And again, it's something that you don't necessarily memorize, you look up, because there are different ways for documenting something like a website than it would be for documenting a book. But from a common sense perspective, it's basically just trying to give the reader enough information so that they could find the text that you used and they could verify the authenticity of your quote. And that said, technically you would be writing a works cited page, but since you are not referring to outside sources, you're writing a critical paper. As far as I'm concerned, you don't need to include the works cited page, because you would be citing either Frankenstein or perhaps Edgar Allan Poe's short story or perhaps Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. If you do submit in a works cited page, make sure that you're doing it correctly. And I have a couple of websites, and this is in the fourth section below, that I recommend. Purdue OWL, which I suspect you've probably heard of in other English classes. And this is from Purdue University. It goes through the entire writing process. And there's a section that's devoted just to documentation and quoting. And what's so nice is that even though it's through Purdue University, they made it accessible to the public so we can all access it. The GCC Library is also a great website. They are well aware that you are going to be writing papers in college. And on the library webpage, they have a link that's devoted just to documentation and the system of the MLA, which is what we're using, as well as other systems, such as the APA for the sciences. So basically, those are the websites that I encourage you to look at. And again, we'll be talking a little bit more about the construction of papers as the semester progresses. I encourage you to read that handout from my own undergraduate career so that you can get a sense as to how I was schooled. It's still valid all of these years later. You'll see that what we will be doing next class is talking specifically about the Poe short stories. And next Monday, the 9th of October, is Indigenous Peoples Day. So we will not be having class on that day. And I'll be posting that on our Moodle site to remember. And then on Wednesday, October 11th, this is where we begin talking about Jekyll and Hyde. So for the attendance question, that would be due on Wednesday, the 4th. And of course, if you need additional time, let me know. As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. And that'll give you a good idea what we talked about during our class discussions. And perhaps something in the discussion forum will spur an idea for a paper. But at any rate, today's question, as you know, I like to ask questions that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers, questions that just require reasoning and debate. Out of the 4 Poe short stories that I've assigned, and understand there are many, many Poe short stories, but I deliberately chose 4 stories that could be fit into the Gothic tradition. That would be The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat. Out of those 4, which short story did you like the best? And more importantly, why? So I hope you're doing well, and I'm doing well. Honestly, I'm feeling a little achy and a little tired because I had my vaccination yesterday. But it was well worth getting my vaccination yesterday. So I highly encourage all of you to get your vaccination because none of us want to repeat what happened in 2020. So again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about Edgar Allan Poe. Take care. Bye-bye.